For over 33 months, Russia has been at war with Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Robke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we begin in the northeastern Ukrainian region of Kharkiv. There, Ukraine has struck an important blow against the Russian occupiers. They had successfully managed to cross over the Oskil River and made additional advances further into the Kharkiv region, notably on the more western side. Here we see footage of the Ukrainian army showing how infantry troops were deployed using an M113 personnel carrier to storm a forest. And we can now see that these infantrymen, and this is something different from what we typically see, namely here are the soldiers and here is the T-64 tank, that they advanced together against the Russian occupiers on the west bank of the Oskil. And that's an extremely important decision that Ukraine made there to drive the Russians out. Because we know that natural obstacles like the Oskil River are actually those on whom one must depend, particularly when defending, making efforts not to let the Russians cross there, and naturally not over the Dnieper and other such natural barriers. To create and build the most effective defense possible for the whole Kharkiv region, we observe, as noted, that these tank units have, or at least individual tanks with infantry, coordinated here to specifically hunt down these Russian soldiers. It was probably about 50 Russians who have been holding the west bank of the Oskil here for a week just north of Kupiansk near Dvorichna. We'll take a look at the map in a moment. And for the Ukrainians, it was extremely important to counterattack here and not just say, okay, then we'll move back another 5 kilometers, letting the Russians advance further. Then they might have successfully managed to transport floating and heavy equipment all the way over to the western bank of the Oskil, even in spite of those destroyed bridges. Then it would have been a really tough situation for the Ukrainians. Here we see the aerial recordings of something. From an eastern drone perspective, we can see that it's a very mountainous landscape, a difficult terrain to access, but we just saw that the Russian soldiers could be driven out here. And here is one of the boats that the Russian soldiers used to come across the Oskil River. But these boats and all landing troops and the bridgehead were also destroyed here. We now see the small villages that are back under Ukrainian control. There we see it. The blue-white, blue-yellow flag, of course, is being hoisted for Ukraine. And the unit has proudly presented here that they have at least their own shore. Has returned the Oskil River's western bank to Ukrainian control. We'll take a quick look at the map and see that in Kupiansk, yes. So far, the fighting has only been on the eastern side of the Oskil. So here is the strategically important city of Kupiansk, and here's the Oskil. Let's try to draw it in. That's the river. It continues along here and up here. It narrows a bit, which makes it a bit, not as wide anymore, and that makes it particularly easy for the Russians to get through further north here. Further south, the Oskil is up to 3 kilometers wide, making it almost impossible. But up here, they managed to come across slightly to the north of Dvorichna, and they have now been effectively and successfully pushed back by the Ukrainian army. This situation eases some pressure on Ukrainian forces, as they no longer need to worry about Russians flanking them in Kupiansk and advancing from their riverside. However, we continue to observe robust offensive movements by the Russian army targeting Kupiansk, coming in both from here, on the northeastern side, as well as directly from the east and the south, where the Russians are trying to continually squeeze the bridgehead that the Ukrainians have established here. We see it down here in the very southern part of this map. The Russians have already come right up to the eastern enclosure and of course also to the north. This means that this is a really small pocket that still exists, where the Ukrainians have to supply their own forces across the river with ammunition, food, and of course weapon support, which is very, very challenging. So much for the situation in Kharkiv in the northeast of the country. We're moving a bit further south into the Donetsk region, where we need to look at 2 major battles, the Battle of Velika Novosilka and the Battle of Kurakhove. And we'll begin with the first mentioned city, a city situated in the southeastern part of the front, where we have both encouraging and discouraging news for Ukraine. I suppose we'll begin with the unfortunate news side. There is another area that has been seized by Russian forces, specifically the town of Blahodatne. Blahodatne, another suburb of Velika Novosilka, where now the Russian flag waves atop one of the largest buildings. And once again, the Russians demonstrate here, with the soldier standing next to it, that it wasn't just hung there with a drone for propaganda purposes, but that they have indeed advanced into this place, and now Blahodatne is under Russian control. When the camera zooms out a bit, we are able to see that the place is relatively small with only around 1,000 inhabitants, but it also featured some strong and larger buildings. We can see that right here now, as I mentioned earlier. I believe the flag was raised on what appears to be the 3rd or 4th floor, and unfortunately, the area is now completely and entirely under Russian control. And this is particularly frustrating for the Ukrainian army, because in the summer and fall of 2023, they sacrificed an extremely large number of men and made tremendous efforts. efforts. Now we see the house again from a bit further away, aiming to free Blagodatno and around 12 other locations in this region from Russian control. Now the whole area has fallen back under Russian control. This implies that Velika Novosilka is facing a significant threat from the south by the Russian army, which has managed to gain control over this now completely devastated place here. A bit further north, however, there is positive news for Ukraine. They don't appear to be completely giving up on Velika Novosilka, particularly from the surrounding area near Novi Koma. Novi Koma was another place captured by the Russian army north of, as mentioned, Velika Novosilka, and there the Ukrainians launched a small counterattack. They claimed, and we can at least see from this flag, that they managed to drive the Russians out of a village, with the aim of preventing the cut-off of yet another connection and supply route for Velika Novosilka to the Russian army. Much like in Kharkiv, we see a small village recapture led by the Ukrainian army, clearly demonstrating that they are not solely in retreat. We're looking at the map right now and see these two developments that we just saw in the two videos. On the one hand, Blagodatne here in the south, meaning this small place is now also under Russian control, and we see that it's only about 4 to 5 kilometers. To Velika Novosilka from the south, that means the Russians have already approached the city directly from the east. In the south, they are now also on the verge. And the second was Novi Koma, a very, very small place, but right along this connecting road. And we mentioned in the past days that originally there were a total of 5 connection roads to Velika Novosilka, of which currently, until yesterday, only one remained under Ukrainian control. And now they have successfully recaptured that second one here. This means that with Novi Koma being recaptured, Velika Novosilka can once again be supplied from the northern direction. So at least the current status. Of course, we do not know if the Russians have launched another counterattack if the location now marked in blue here by our map provider Deep State Map is now once again under Russian control. However, that is the most recent status from last night, which we are able to present to you right now. We want to head further east to Kurakhove. There is intense fighting there as well. Over the past few days, the Russians have attempted a strategic move there, and in an attempt to encircle and trap a group of Ukrainian soldiers by advancing northward with numerous tanks positioned even further to the west.
And that's quite a long time, I think, it has been built.
We observe one of these military columns making its way forward once more with the strategic intent of maneuvering around Kurakhove. They aim to effectively flank the location and launch an attack from the southern side. Let's view the footage first. The Ukrainians observed everything closely with drones and saw vehicles like MTLB, and will also see tanks soon that were advancing there, making an effort to push out toward the western side of Kurakhove from the southern direction and aiming to encircle more than 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers in total as part of their overarching strategy, who are defending not only the town of Kurakhove, but also approximately 5 additional surrounding suburbs within this almost fully encircled pocket. But we see the Ukrainian army has done a thorough job here and has destroyed these Russian vehicles one after another. Now we're observing another attack, and we can already notice that on the towers and even on the mobile weapon systems. These are not MTLBs, but in this case, they are battle tanks of the Russian army, which look quite similar because they all have these huge structures to... one of them, well... that's actually an armored personnel carrier designed to safeguard the soldiers and primarily to defend against drone attacks. But we keep seeing that these setups and all the attempts to defend here were relatively in vain. Because indeed, we now have this roof placed on top here. You can see it over there, so no drone can possibly break through anymore. We can see very clearly here, this is the impact sensor of the drone, which is currently attacking the tank from the rear right side and consequently leads to the subsequent explosion of this vehicle. These drones here are used, the group wanted to show that, to make it clear again and again that you are very, very dependent on these drones, these little kamikaze drones, which are mostly funded by donations, mainly from the activist Sternenko. That's why we see his symbol down there too, that they continue receiving and using these drones. Otherwise, they wouldn't stand a chance of defending Kurakhove anymore. We're entering the map here, taking another look at the situation in Kurakhove, and what we just saw was, as mentioned, a major attempt to create an encirclement, which thankfully failed. Namely from Maximivka, meaning from here. These tank advances started and went, and as we see here in this direction, that implies they've managed to make it quite a distance. They've progressed to the west of Konstantinopolske, only to be halted later on, and this is remarkably crucial for the Ukrainian army. Approximately, 10 kilometers south of Kurakhove, they were halted. Had that not occurred, if this advance involving around 10 tanks had pushed through, Then we would have a Ukrainian group of, as mentioned, nearly 1,000 soldiers who would be encircled here. Fortunately, that specific situation didn't take place because Ukraine was well capable of helping itself. From eastern Ukraine's Donetsk, we move to western Russia's Kursk. There, heavy fighting continues, and the Ukrainian army is doing everything beyond the direct front lines and direct clashes to weaken Russian logistics as much as possible. And here we have quite impressive footage showing us the systematic approach and also the sheer volume with which these Ukrainian drones are deployed. To repeatedly target, for example, Ural trucks far ahead of reaching the front, meaning 10 to 15 kilometers before they are actually at the front, with the aim to annihilate them there. So now we see the attacks one after the other. That was just the first drone that made it. And now we can distinctly see here that this is indeed the truck which was just recently attacked a few moments ago. And here is the second truck, which is also an Ural vehicle, and it's about to be attacked by the subsequent drone. Here's the scene again. The one was just standing there below. Now the second Ural truck is coming. Even that's getting attacked. And it really is systematic how a large portion of Russian support is being destroyed here. We also saw here again, the Ukrainians always try to prove that their attacks have made a difference. Earlier, we observed that the drone struck at a slightly lower point than initially intended, but nevertheless it was sufficiently impactful to cause a significant traffic accident, effectively disabling and immobilizing the Ural truck's vehicle completely, even if there might not have been any wounded inside. And these scenes repeat not only with military vehicles, but also with what are essentially civilian vehicles, which of course are used by the Russian army to provide and handle supplies in the area. You can really see that with such, yes, amazing structures. This was likely a Buchanka bus, now fully transformed and built over with a sturdy structure to effectively defend it against drones. However, those who understand the mechanics of an RPG-7 warhead are aware that it quite frankly takes a substantial amount of armor to effectively stop it. Classic tanks might be able to handle this, but definitely not those kinds of sheet metal builds. So we repeatedly see the Ukrainian army trying to attack these different roads. We see time and again how she manages it. Here we see it. These vehicles often used for civilian purposes because Russia is focusing heavily on Ukraine and relatively less on Kursk. In those areas, they aren't employing as many military vehicles, especially outside the main offensive directions. And that's why it's continually civilian vehicles being attacked in these areas. Ukraine makes efforts to demonstrate that each day at least 10, 15, and sometimes as many as 20 of these vehicles are actually and definitively targeted before reaching the front and before delivering the respective weapons. And so far, it must be said clearly, this operation in Kursk, which has already been going on for over 4 months, is relatively successful. You still maintain control over about half of the area originally occupied in August. Finally, let's look at another strategy that we have already mentioned. Here, there are actually brand new recordings specifically about drone defense. We know that the Russians utilize various types of drones, the cheaper kamikaze models and also those expensive ones that operate with fiber optics. But also these reconnaissance drones that we see here, namely the DJI Mavic 3 and others, which are then also used to drop grenades. And Ukraine figured, since these drones are rather hard to bring down with electronic warfare, they might as well apply kinetic measures, specifically by simply employing nets, which are fired at these drones. And now we can see that here probably from the 3D printer, a device that then fires a net at the expensive, about 1,500 euro expensive Chinese drone down there. And we see the same thing happening repeatedly. And it's really important to see that these are not just reconnaissance drones, but we see that the Russian drone is dropping a grenade here at this moment, attacking a Ukrainian position, and now it's being attacked as well. The net is now caught here, and we simultaneously see the explosion of the Russian drone and the crash. The explosion caused by the Russian drone. And the crash of the Russian drone right next to it. That means this is indeed a relatively effective tactic that the Ukrainian army is utilizing here, having reportedly managed to bring down more than 1,000 Russian surveillance drones from the sky. When we calculate this, these 1,000 drones represent not only a substantial financial purchase, but also approximately €1 million in loss due to their destruction. Using such straightforward nets, which are deployed in this area to pursue and intercept incoming Russian drones. We see the activists who find it crucial to show everything because these are naturally, in many cases, nets funded by donations, drones funded by donations are used. In this regard, it's important for them not only for propaganda purposes, but also to continually show the donors and the activists who provide these drones for them, yes, it works. Yes, what you provide us with helps us in the war against Russia. And so we repeatedly see these recordings here from the Ukrainian side, and they tend to run for quite a while. That means Ukraine has come up with relatively good tactics by now and employed them. On the one hand, against the large surveillance drones of the Russian army. These RAM drones are used there, the small FPV drones, costing about 500 to 1,000 euros, and they bring down Russian drones that cost from 10,000 to 30,000 euros each. And indeed, against the smaller quadcopters, a tactical approach has now been developed. While it certainly doesn't keep the entire sky free of Russian aerial vehicles, it does contribute to a relatively significant sense of calmness, or at least a relative possibility to combat the Russians here within one's own country, even in terms of airspace and sky control.